Some horror films unsettle because they violate tone, morality, or the sense that the viewer is meant to feel safe observing from a distance. The entries on this list aren't extreme for the sake of shock. They're disturbing because they feel misaligned. Stories where cruelty lingers too long, violence feels intimate, or the atmosphere presses uncomfortably close. These are horror films that feel wrong to watch. Not because they are forbidden, but because they refuse to offer distance, relief, or permission. Directed by James Landis, The Sadist is a grim, punishing roadside nightmare that feels wrong almost immediately. Not because of what it shows, but because of how long it forces you to sit with it. Loosely inspired by real crimes, the film traps three stranded travelers in the desert with a young killer whose violence is casual, prolonged, and unnervingly intimate. Landis shoots the film with a documentary harshness. There's no stylization to soften the cruelty, no music to signal when fear should rise or fall. The desert is flat, exposed, and indifferent, offering nowhere to hide and no visual relief. Scenes stretch uncomfortably, allowing humiliation and threat to linger far longer than narrative efficiency would normally allow. The killer's behavior is what makes the film feel transgressive. He isn't theatrical or mysterious. He's petulant, bored, and cruel in small, repetitive ways. The kind of violence that feels improvised rather than plotted. Power shifts slowly, deliberately, as the victims realize escape may depend less on courage than submission. The Sadist feels wrong to watch because it denies catharsis. There's no clever reversal, no moral balance restored. The film forces the viewer into the same helpless position as its characters, watching, waiting, and realizing that cruelty doesn't always need justification. Sometimes it only needs opportunity and someone willing to keep looking. Directed by Kaneto Shindo, Onibaba is a feral, punishing work of Japanese horror that strips human behavior down to hunger, jealousy, and survival. Set in medieval Japan during a time of war and famine, the film follows two women who murder wandering samurai and dispose of their bodies in a deep pit, sustaining themselves through theft and desperation. What begins as survival slowly curdles into cruelty. Shindo shoots the film in stark black and white, using tall reeds, oppressive wind, and suffocating sound design to create a world that feels hostile to morality itself. Nature isn't a backdrop here, it's an accomplice. The landscape presses inward, amplifying paranoia. Desire once awakened becomes a corrosive force, reshaping loyalty into resentment and need into violence. What makes Onibaba feel wrong to watch is its refusal to moralize. The film never excuses its characters, but it never condemns them either. Hunger and lust are treated as elemental forces, as natural and destructive as the storms that batter the fields. The infamous mask, grotesque and symbolic, doesn't introduce evil. It implicates the viewer. It asks you to witness suffering without judgment and to recognize how thin the boundary is between survival and savagery. By the time punishment arrives, it feels less like justice and more like inevitability, a reminder that when the world collapses, morality often follows it into the pit. Kuroneko is a ghost story that feels wrong not because of what it shows, but because of how quietly it seduces. Also directed by Kaneto Shindo, set in feudal Japan, the film follows a mother and daughter-in-law who are assaulted and murdered by samurai, only to return as vengeful spirits luring wandering warriors to their deaths. What unfolds is not rage, but ritual, a cycle of beauty, violence, and mourning, repeated with unsettling calm. Shindo frames the supernatural with elegance rather than terror. White kimonos glow against inky darkness. Movement is slow, deliberate, almost graceful. The violence, when it occurs, feels ceremonial, stripped of chaos or desperation. This restraint makes the film's cruelty feel intimate, as though the audience is being invited to observe something sacred that should remain private. The spirits are sympathetic, even tragic, yet their vengeance is merciless. Love and violence coexist without resolution. The ghosts do not seek closure, they seek repetition. By refusing to frame revenge as empowerment or justice, Kuroneko leaves the viewer suspended between empathy and revulsion. It suggests that trauma doesn't always demand release. Sometimes it simply repeats itself, beautifully and endlessly, until everyone involved becomes complicit, including those who sit quietly and watch. Directed by Narciso Ibáñez Serrador, The House That Screamed is a psychological horror film that feels wrong to watch because it disguises exploitation as discipline and cruelty as education. Set in an isolated boarding school for troubled young women, the film unfolds as a series of disappearances that everyone seems disturbingly willing to rationalize. Sarador constructs the school as a closed system. Punishment is routine. Authority is unquestioned. Long corridors, locked doors, and rigid schedules create a suffocating atmosphere where fear is normalized and resistance is quietly erased. The horror doesn't come from sudden violence, but from how methodically control is enforced and how easily abuse becomes invisible once it's institutionalized. What makes the film especially uncomfortable is its voyeuristic tension. The camera lingers where it shouldn't, mirroring the audience's own uneasy position as observer. As students vanish, the film refuses to treat their absence as a mystery to be solved quickly. Instead, it becomes a condition of the environment, a reminder that survival depends on compliance, not innocence. The house that screamed feels wrong because it implicates the viewer in the system it portrays. You aren't invited to challenge the authority on screen. You're forced to endure it, watching as cruelty is justified by routine and silence. By the time the truth emerges, it doesn't feel like revelation, it feels like confirmation. Directed by Joseph Losey, The Damned is a bleak, disquieting film that feels wrong to watch because it weaponizes realism against the viewer. Disguised as a youth gang drama and sci-fi thriller, it slowly reveals itself as something far colder, a meditation on state control, moral indifference, and lives treated as expendable experiments. Losey grounds the film in harsh social reality. Seaside towns feel windswept and empty, authority figures speak with bureaucratic calm, and violence arrives without melodrama. When the film's central secret is finally exposed, a group of children isolated and irradiated for government testing, the horror isn't sensationalized. It's clinical. The children aren't monsters. They're calm, polite, and already resigned to their fate. No rescue fantasy, no illusion that exposure will change anything. Adults fail quietly. Institutions remain intact. The children understand their situation more clearly than anyone else, and that awareness becomes the film's most devastating element. The Damned denies the audience moral release. It doesn't ask you to fear what's being created. It asks you to confront what society is willing to sacrifice in the name of progress. By the end, the film leaves you with a deeply uncomfortable truth. Some horrors aren't accidents or aberrations. They're policies, carried out calmly, by people who never see themselves as villains. Nightmare is a psychological thriller that traps the audience inside a woman's unraveling perception and refuses to offer stable ground. Directed by Freddie Francis and starring Jenny Linden, David Knight, and Moira Redmond, the film follows a young woman haunted by traumatic childhood memories that begin resurfacing through visions, accusations, and an encroaching sense that reality itself is conspiring against her. Francis directs with surgical precision. Domestic spaces feel hostile rather than safe, and mirrors, corridors, and staircases become instruments of disorientation. The film's tension doesn't come from overt menace, but from erosion. The slow collapse of certainty as the protagonist's experiences are repeatedly dismissed, reinterpreted, or weaponized against her. Every reassurance feels conditional. Every explanation carries an ulterior motive. What makes Nightmare especially uncomfortable is its treatment of trauma. The film doesn't allow the viewer to step back and assess events objectively. Instead, it aligns perception with vulnerability, forcing the audience to share the character's confusion and dread. The horror emerges from the realization that sanity itself can be negotiated by those in power. Nightmare feels wrong to watch because it implicates the viewer in the gaslighting it portrays. You are encouraged to doubt what you're seeing, even as the evidence mounts. By the time the truth is revealed, the damage has already been done, and clarity offers no relief. It only confirms how easily reality can be bent when someone else controls the narrative. Directed by George Blair, The Hypnotic Eye turns spectacle into manipulation, inviting the audience to participate in the very violation it depicts. Framed around a nightclub hypnotist whose performances leave women psychologically shattered and sometimes dead, the film blurs the line between entertainment and exploitation with unnerving ease. Blair stages the hypnosis sequences like public rituals. The audience within the film watches eagerly, detached, entertained, never questioning their own role in what unfolds on stage. That mirrored dynamic is what makes the film so uncomfortable. You're placed in the same position, observing vulnerability presented as performance, encouraged to treat suffering as curiosity rather than harm. The horror here isn't supernatural, it's procedural. Authority figures investigate methodically while the damage continues quietly in private spaces. Hypnosis becomes a metaphor for control, not mystical but psychological, exposing how easily autonomy can be suspended when framed as consent or spectacle. The hypnotic eye refuses to distance the viewer from responsibility. It doesn't ask you to fear the hypnotist alone. It asks you to recognize how readily an audience accepts coercion when it's packaged as entertainment. By the end, the film leaves an unsettling question hanging in the air. At what point does watching become participation, and how much harm is made possible by people who never leave their seats? The Ghost is a gothic horror film that feels wrong to watch because it luxuriates in moral decay without offering judgment or restraint. Directed by Ricardo Frida and starring Barbara Steele, set in a crumbling mansion dominated by betrayal and obsession, the film follows a woman trapped in a marriage defined by cruelty, manipulation, and mounting violence. A domestic hell rendered in velvet shadows and candlelight. Frida's direction is deliberately indulgent. The camera lingers on corruption rather than recoiling from it, allowing cruelty to unfold slowly and intimately. The house itself feels complicit. Corridors suffocate, rooms press inward, and every exchange seems charged with something unspeakable. Steele's performance anchors the film, her presence both victimized and quietly dangerous, blurring the line between suffering and transformation. What makes The Ghost so unsettling is its emotional ambiguity. Sympathy shifts constantly. Power changes hands without warning. Violence is not framed as intrusion, but as inheritance, something absorbed and repurposed rather than resisted. The film never offers moral clarity, forcing the viewer to remain inside the discomfort it creates. The Ghost feels wrong to watch because it denies release. It doesn't punish corruption or redeem suffering. Instead, it presents a closed world where cruelty circulates endlessly, feeding on itself. By the time the film reaches its conclusion, you're left with the unnerving sense that escape was never part of the design, only endurance. Directed by Harvey Hart and starring Leslie Nielsen in one of the most unsettling performances of his career, Dark Intruder feels wrong to watch because it weaponizes charm and intellect against the viewer. Set in late 19th century San Francisco, the film follows a respected scholar who becomes involved in a series of ritualistic murders connected to ancient cult practices, a role Nielsen plays with unsettling warmth and confidence. Hart frames the horror through respectability. Nielsen's character is not overtly sinister. He's articulate, curious, and disarmingly calm. That normalcy is what corrodes the film from within, suggesting that evil doesn't need madness or rage to operate effectively. It only needs credibility. The violence remains largely off-screen, but the ideological threat is persistent. As the final entry on this list, Dark Intruder earns its place not through excess, but through quiet violation. It leaves you with the uneasy realization that the most dangerous figures are often the ones who appear most reasonable. These films feel wrong to watch not because they break rules, but because they refuse to follow the unspoken contract between horror and audience. They don't provide distance, catharsis, or the comfort of clear morality. Instead, they linger, forcing you to sit with cruelty, complicity, and unease long after the story should have moved on. If any of these films made you uncomfortable in ways you didn't expect, let me know which one stayed with you the most. And if you're drawn to horror that unsettles rather than entertains, subscribe and join Silver Shivers. Horror doesn't always shock or scream. Sometimes it watches back, quietly, asking how long you're willing to stay.